Hello, this is Jacqueline from Jack Knits, and today we're going to talk about how to convert a knitted stitch pattern that is written to be knitted flat to be worked in the round. When would you want to do that, you ask? Well, maybe you run across a beautiful stitch pattern that you see online or written in a book, and most times that is going to be written assuming you're going to be knitting it flat. But what if you want to knit it in the round, maybe for a hat or some other project? Well, I'm going to show you how to do that conversion because there are three major things that you need to think about when you are converting that stitch pattern. So let's talk about those three things and then do a practice one together. Okay, to get started today, we're going to be using some stitch pattern examples that I have found in this Vogue Knitting book. So if you are interested in looking further into this book or maybe purchasing it for yourself, I will have a link in the description below, but all the sample patterns that we're going to be looking at can be found in this book. All right, well, to identify the three major things that you need to concern yourself with converting a stitch pattern to in the round is by identifying what the difference is between knitting flat and in the round. So the very first thing to consider is that when you are knitting flat, you are often adding some stitches to the edge of your knitting to either one, give it a little salvaged edge to make it look a little bit neater on the edge, or sometimes just to give it a little bit of symmetry, right? You might want to add some stitching columns to the left and right that kind of center the stitch pattern nicely. And let me show you what I mean by that. Take a look at an example of a stitch pattern that you might want to consider converting. So this particular one you can see is comprised of a row of ribbing and then a lace row or column and then some ribbing and then lace, ribbing, lace, etc. Well, this particular flat knitting pattern is showing you that we are going to be knitting first a column of ribbing and then some lace, and that is what we're going to repeat. Column of ribbing, lace, ribbing, lace, ribbing, lace, and then they're adding another column of ribbing at the end. And the reason that they're doing that, let me just kind of show here, is that they want this to look symmetrical. So, but really, if you're thinking about it, the pattern really is only these two columns just repeated over and over again. And then they just added this extra column just to give it some symmetry, right? They want that column to be on both sides. But when we're knitting in the round, I'll show you my round example here, we don't have any edges, right? There are no start and stop to our knitting. It's just a circular tube of knitting, so we do not need to be concerned with an edge to make it symmetrical or to make it look pretty on the edge. There is no edges. So we know that for those type of patterns that have those extra stitches, we can remove that. So that is our first thing that we need to consider is remove. Remove those extra stitches that fall outside the repeating boundaries of your knitting. Okay, so that is the very first thing, and we're going to talk about some exceptions to that at the end. I want you to make sure that you're aware that there can be some patterns that make that a little bit difficult to decipher, but we'll look at that a little bit later on in this video. Okay, the second thing that you want to consider when knitting in the round instead of flat is that when you're knitting flat, you are always knitting your stitches from the right to the left on your right side rows. Then when you switch and turn over and you're knitting your wrong side rows, you are actually knitting it in the other direction, right? We're knitting it this way on our right side rows and then this way on the way back. So that is the way a knitted pattern is written out for knitting in the flat, is that it's giving you instructions from what to stitch this way and then what to stitch backwards on the other side. But again, when you're knitting in the round, you are never turning your work. You're always knitting in the same direction. When you're done with one row, you continue to knit in the same direction for the wrong side row and continue all the way. So then we need to consider a knit stitch pattern for the wrong side rows. We need to knit them backwards because it's going to be written to knit this way on the way back. We need to make sure that every row we are knitting from right to left. Therefore, every other row, we need to convert those stitches backwards. So that's the number 2. Make your wrong side rows, your even number of rows, to be backwards. Okay, so we've got remove and we've got backwards. Let's take a look at the third way. Again, when we're looking at our flat knitting stitches, you can see, especially on these little knit stitches where the V's are facing towards you, that is a knit stitch when you're knitting on the right side of the fabric. To continue that look of knit stitches facing outward, the wrong side, or row 2 of such a knitting pattern, would be a purl stitch. You're knitting on the right side, you'd be purling on the wrong side to produce that knitted fabric. Well, same principle applies here, right? In the round, we are always knitting with the right side towards us. So every time we want this knit stitch, we're going to knit it every time. We're not going to purl it on the second row. We're going to continue to knit it because we're always knitting on the right side of the fabric. Therefore, on those or even number rows when we are supposed to be knitting the back side, but we're not, we're knitting all the way around, we're going to knit the opposite of the stitch. So that's the third thing. We need to knit opposite of what is written in the knitted instructions for those every other rows. Okay, so that sounded really complicated, right? But it really is not when you actually take a look at examples. So let's do that next. All right, let's take a look at a particular knit stitch pattern as an example and try to convert it ourselves to knitting in the round. So I've chosen this sugar cube pattern here. It's a fairly simple pattern, so it's not going to be too complicated, but it shows you all three principles, right, of removing, backwards, and opposite. First, let's think about removing stitches. So when you see a written knitting pattern, it will also often tell you how many stitches to cast on, and it will tell it in something like this. It'll say multiple of 8 stitches plus 1. So that plus 1 gives you the clue that the multiple of 8 is what lies within the repeat section of the pattern, and that plus 1 is what the designer just added to the outside of the knitting structure to give it some, either, like we mentioned, some symmetry or an edging. And in this case, I think it was just some edging that they added. So that's our first clue, that that plus 1 can probably be eliminated in our conversion. Another clue that you can look for that is if it includes a chart of the stitch pattern, and that can be a topic for another day on how to read charts, but just to recognize that they often will put a little red or bold line around the repeat section of the pattern, and then laying outside of that repeat is that row or column of stitches that is extra, that we can remove when we're knitting in the round. Okay, so that's kind of when you eyeball a pattern and you see that plus 1, or you notice that bunch of stitches lay outside of that repeat section, that tells you that you can remove those stitches when converting. So let's do a practice here. I have copied that stitch pattern in my notebook here, so we can create a in the round pattern next to it. So let's talk about, make sure that you can see this. Okay, round. Let's now convert this pattern to in the round. Okay, so let's first think about that first concept, right, of removing stitches, which we already kind of identified by looking at that pattern, that there's probably that plus 1 that can be removed. So when we think about how many stitches to cast on for a project, for flat, it's saying a multiple of 8 plus 1, so either 8, 16, 24, 32, etc., plus 1, so you would need to add 1 to that, so you would have to cast on 9 or 17. You see the pattern there. So, but with knitting in the round, we don't need this plus 1. We just need to cast on a multiple of 8 stitches. So that was our first thing that we need to identify, is how many stitches to cast on. We're going to just do a multiple of 8 stitches. Don't need that plus 1. Okay, so then we can immediately go through the rest of the pattern right off the bat and remove those extra stitches. When you're looking at a written pattern, the repeat sections are often identified in between these little asterisks. So that shows you what's being repeated. And then those extra stitches are going to be written outside of that asterisk. So we right away know that here's a repeat, and then there's that one, that +1 that's on the outside. We know we're not going to need that. We know we're not going to need this purl one that's outside of that repeat, so we can immediately limit that. Eliminate this one also as outside of that repeat, and this purl one is. Okay, so now we've eliminated that first step of removing those extra stitches. All right, now let's take it row by row on how we need to convert it. So row 1 is your right side row, correct? So that is saying, and those right side rows, we do not need to change really, other than eliminating those extra stitches. We can knit those as written after we remove those stitches. So row 1 is okay, row 3 is okay, row 5 is okay, and row 7 is okay. So we know for row 1, we can knit just as it is written. Okay, now row number 2. On your odd side rows, we need to do something about those. I'm sorry, your even number rows, whatever is considered the wrong side. Remember, we need to knit it backwards and we need to knit it opposite. Well, row number 2 is very easy. It's just saying that we're going to purl all the stitches. So knitting it backwards or right side has no effect on it. We know we need to do the same stitch across the whole row. But what about opposite? What is the opposite of the purl stitch? It's a knit stitch. So we know for this one, instead of purling, we're going to knit all stitches. Okay. All right, row number 3. Again, that one's good. We've already eliminated that extra stitch. So for row 3, we do not really need to do any backwards or opposite of the pattern. We're just going to simply knit it as is, but without that extra. So we're just going to jump right into the repeat and say purl 2, knit 6, repeat. So the only thing we did there is remove that extra stitch. Okay, here's another one that we need to convert, and this one's a little bit trickier because it's got some stitches in it. So row 4 is a conversion row because it's the wrong side row, but now we need to knit it backwards and opposite. Okay, so now we have to read it this way, backwards, and we've already eliminated that stitch. We don't need that. Let's start over here with the asterisk, and the opposite, or the backwards, if we're going to knit it this way. The opposite now of knitting for knit 2 is purl 2, right? A purl is the opposite of knitting, so that's going to be purl 2. And then the opposite of purling 6 is knit 6. So again, for this one, we eliminated that extra, and we're doing it backwards and opposite. So backwards, starting at the end and going this way, purl 2, the opposite, knit 6, the opposite of this. Okay, with me so far? Row 5. We are okay with this row. We don't need to change anything. We don't need to remove anything backwards or anything. It's all good. So row 5 is all knit. Row 6, we're back on that wrong side row again. So that is a conversion row. We don't have to eliminate anything, no extra stitches. Knitting it backwards doesn't change anything, but we do need to apply our opposite effect, and we need to knit these stitches instead of purl. So row 6 is knit. All right, on to row 7, which is an okay row. Again, just remove that extra stitch and we can knit it just as is. So we're going to do our repeat section of knitting 4, purling 2, knitting 2, and repeating. All right, now the final row in this pattern is the wrong side row, so we need to do backwards and opposite again. We've already eliminated that extra stitch. Let's work backwards. The opposite of purling 4 is going to be knit 4. Opposite of knitting 2 is going to be purling 2. And the opposite of purling 2 is going to be knit 2. So that is our backwards and opposite of row 8. All right, so there we did it. So now this is our new instructions for knitting in the round. We remove those extra stitches on rows 2, 4, 6, and 8. We read them backwards and opposite, and there we go. So that is the simple explanation of how to convert written flat stitches into the round. So let's talk about a little bit of some exceptions, especially to that remove section where we talk about removing those extra stitches. What if the stitches look a little bit complicated? What do we do then? Let's take a look. All right, let's talk about a little bit of some of the exceptions to the rules that we just discussed, or some things that you might want to keep in mind. First of all, let's think about when we say knitting the opposite stitch of what the pattern calls for in those wrong side rows. Let's talk a little bit about what some of those opposite stitches are. In this example that we just did, they're very easy. The opposite of knitting is, of course, purl. And the opposite of purling is, of course, knitting. So that is easy, right? That's an easy definition. Some other things to think about when you're thinking about knitting the opposite way is oftentimes when you are doing a slip stitch, the designer is going to tell you where to hold your yarn when you're slipping the stitch. And they'll abbreviate it something like that. They'll say with yarn in back, WYIB, which stands for with yarn in back. Indicating hold your yarn in the back when you're slip stitching this stitch. The opposite of holding your yarn in the back is holding your yarn in the front. So if on the wrong side of your fabric, or those even rows where you have to convert and knit backwards and opposite, the opposite of with yarn in back is going to be with yarn in front for those slip stitches. So just remember, because that's usually very important where that yarn is falling, because whether or not you're going to see it or not see it on the right side of the fabric. So whenever you see it with yarn in back or with yarn in front, for those rows that you're converting and you're doing it backwards, make sure you're doing it the opposite of way of what it indicates. All right, let's continue to look at a couple other quick examples of patterns. One thing that actually makes converting stitch patterns in the to the round makes it a little bit easier is that oftentimes a kind of a lacy or more complicated pattern will often have the wrong side row be all purl. And you'll see that often in instructions like this where it gives you row by row instructions and it will say row 2 and all wrong side rows purl. Well, when you see that, you're like, oh, thank you, that's so much easier now to convert. So now the only thing you have to worry about is eliminating those extra stitches outside of the repeat, that +3, like for this example, on the right and left side of the stitch pattern. But for all those wrong side rows where you normally would be converting backwards and opposite, you just now need to convert it from purl to all knit. Okay, so whenever you see wrong side rows all purl, now you just have to do the wrong side rows all knit and you're all set with that conversion. So super easy for that. Another thing to keep in mind is sometimes the designer will say row 2 and all wrong side rows, it will say knit the knit stitches and purl the purl stitches. Well, in that case, it's just telling you that for those knit stitches, we want to continue to knit them, and for the purl stitches, continue to purl them. That same principle is going to apply when knitting in the round, so you do not need to change those stitches to the other way. You're not going to purl your knits and knit your purls. You're going to do exactly what they said. Knit your knit stitches, purl your purl stitches on those wrong side rows, and you'll be all set. So that's a couple things to keep in mind when it has special instructions for those wrong side rows. Okay, well, what if you're thinking, well, my stitch pattern doesn't seem to have those extra stitches? That's another thing which makes it easier. So let's take a look at this example here. This eyelet pleats pattern just says multiple of 8 stitches, not +1, not +2 or anything, and plus you see in the chart there's no red indicating what is the repeat. So this particular pattern does not have any extra stitches on the edging, it just simply has the repeat. So you know immediately that you do not have to remove any stitches, you just need to do the backward opposite strategy for these, no removing of extra stitches. So that again makes it a little bit easier. Okay, now let's take a look at a stitch pattern where you might think looks much more complicated and you're wondering what to do. So here's a stitch pattern where it says a multiple of 14 stitches plus 8. And look at all these stitches in the chart outside of the repeat. When you've got to be thinking, well, those stitches must be very important. I've got to be able, have to include some of those stitches. Well, let's kind of take a look at what it's trying to do. Again, let's think about the concept of symmetry in a flat pattern. If you look at this particular swatch of fabric and this pattern, it has some edging stitches, then some lace, and then it's got this really fancy lace pattern with another row of lace, a column of lace row, that same complicated lace pattern, and then it finishes with lace and column. So really the repeat of this, again, let me get my little black sheet so we can cover up, is basically this row or this column of stitches through this column of lace. That is what's being repeated. So you do it once, twice, maybe 3, 4, 5 times, no matter whatever your pattern is going to call for. But those little extra stitches on there and the extra stitches here are really not needed because it's not part of the stitch repeat. What that's doing is just giving this stitch pattern some symmetry again in the written. So even though it looks like there's a lot of stitches on either side, it could be that it's just putting those extra stitches for that symmetry. So you can still eliminate those first several and those last few on your pattern and just worry about the repeat section. Okay? All right. Now here's where it gets a little dicey. I'm going to show you an example of that and just kind of the exception to possibly removing those extra stitches may be a little bit difficult to decipher. Okay, so here's a pattern where it says multiple of 4 stitches plus 2. So we're thinking, okay, I can probably eliminate those plus 2. But look at this chart here. It looks a little wonky, right? It's got the repeat section of the chart, these first 4 stitches with these extra plus 2 at the end. But as you go further up your pattern, all of a sudden now it switches to these last 4 stitches being the repeat with the extra stitches over here. So now you have to kind of think, why is that? Why is this the repeat and then it shifts over for this repeat? Well, if you take a look at the swatch that they're showing you, they have this repeat section here, and then you notice that the repeat columns of ribbing here is offset a little bit from that initial thing. So you're kind of knitting along here these several rows, and then the pattern shifts over and you're repeating this way. So that's why it's a little off. So when you want to convert to the round, we can still eliminate these plus 2 stitches, but we need to kind of think a little bit about how this final design is going to work out. If we just simply eliminate those stitches in those extra stitches and knit these 4 stitches that are repeated here and just continue and to knit those again for these additional rows, those repeats are going to line up on top of each other. They're not going to be offset like the designer wants. They want these second set of repeats to be offset from the first. Therefore, when we get to rows 9 through 20, we need to remember that we want to start that repeat 2 stitches in. So we need to start by doing the 2 stitches at the end of that repeat first, and then those first 2. So in a sense, it will shift our repeat pattern appropriately so it's offset. Okay, so if that seems a little complicated or you couldn't quite follow that, don't be alarmed, because that is kind of a messy concept to think about, and you really have to understand the intricacies of a pattern. So don't worry about that. If you see a pattern that has this kind of off repeat, you know what? It might be just simpler to find a much more simple pattern to convert. Don't worry about it. I bail on things all the time, right? You like looking at that and go, oh, that's going to be too complicated to knit in the round. I'm just going to find some other pattern. That's okay. But just know that there are some patterns that can get a little squirrely, that you have to kind of think about the construction of that stitch in order to make it work. And what you'll find that you're doing most of the time is doing some swatches of the pattern. If I'm trying to convert something like this, I will first knit a flat swatch so I can see exactly how the pattern is supposed to look and make sure it looks like the sample. Then I will probably do several swatches of it in the round to try to figure out what's the best way to convert it and if I have to rearrange the order of this repeat to make it look the same. So there we have it, some simple ways to convert your written flat pattern to in the round, and also talked about some of the exceptions. So it really is quite simple if you kind of stick to some of the basic patterns. It can get a little squirrely sometimes, but don't worry. The three main concepts for you to think about: removing, backwards, and opposite apply to all of those concepts. So thanks for watching, everyone. If you found this helpful, you might also find helpful some video that I created about how to read knitting patterns and all the intricacies about that. So I will have a link to that in the description below, and also at the end of this video, you can refer to that as well. Happy knitting, everyone. Thanks for watching.